I found the album tucked behind a box of Christmas decorations in the narrow attic above our kitchen. The cardboard bent where someone had shoved it aside, and the edges softened by a decade of dust. It felt almost apologetic when I drew it out, as if it had been waiting for me, waiting for the right fingers to disturb the quiet between its pages. The cover was leather once, now flaking, the title long rubbed away, and the smell that rose up. Old glue, dried flowers, the sour breath of a house that holds more than memories, made my throat tighten with a nostalgia I could not place. I remember turning the first page and seeing my grandmother smiling at 30, though I had only ever known her at 70. And then my father at 25 with a cigarette between two fingers he later never touched in photographs. Each picture seemed to tug at time instead of preserving it, pulling different years into the same room until everything overlapped. The wallpaper of my childhood living room overlaid with the dress my mother wore to a wedding before I was born. The little wooden train my brother loved tossed into a summer where the trees were bare. At first it was like any family album, awkward holiday poses, candid shots that caught someone mid-laugh, the odd school portrait where a child's smile looked rehearsed and thin. But then, as the attic light thinned and the late afternoon leaned its bone-colored light through the rafters, I found a page where the pictures didn't match our memory at all. There was a photograph of our hallway, the very stretch of wall that led from the front door to the living room. But the hallway was darker in the photo than in any daylight I had ever seen it. The light bulbs in the picture were not lit, and the carpet had a stain we had never noticed in any other season. In the photograph, my mother stood at the far end holding a lamp that did not exist in our house, and beside her a small boy, pale with eyes that caught the camera like a trap, looked straight through the lens and impossibly through me. I turned the page too quickly and felt something like a breath pass across my neck. The next picture was of my bedroom. The same bed, the same floral quilt I had kept despite its frayed seams. But in the photo, the bed was empty, the curtains closed tight, and in the corner where the shadows pooled, there seemed to be a shape that could have been a child holding its knees. Wayne, him. It was not quite a child. It was only the suggestion of a child, a negative image pressed into paper, and my heart folded strange inside my chest at the recognition of a contour I could not remember drawing. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the attic had made me think of things that were not there. I kept turning pages. Each photograph nudged at some corridor of my mind I had assumed had been sealed. There were school pictures where my teacher had eyes that reflected no light, a holiday photo where the fire in the hearth burned blue, a wedding portrait where my parents stood, hands clasped, but behind them the ballroom was full of faces I had never seen. Faces with two wide smiles, mouths that made the suggestion of words but left the air around them still, cold. It was on the third page from the back that I stopped completely, because the photograph there was of me. It was not recent. It was a night picture taken from the foot of my childhood bed, the overhead light off, the only glow coming from a television screen I don't recall ever leaving on. I was small in the frame, knees pulled to my chest, hair spread like a dark halo, and beside the bed, half in shadow, a figure leaned close, its face tilted away but its hand resting on the mattress, as if touching the edge of my world. What froze me was the detail that shouldn't have been. In the mattress where the figure's fingers rested there were small, pale imprints, like the marks of fingertips on skin that had been touched too often, and they were in the same pattern as the faint crescent scar that runs along my own wrist. Where the medicine cabinet once bit me as a child. The album, by the way it seemed to hum when I held it, carried a weight that was not entirely paper. I should have put it back and let the attic claim it again, but the house had become quiet in an uncanny way. The familiar household noises, the refrigerator's dutiful hum, the distant muffled TV from below, the ordinary comforting creaks of a lived-in place were absent. And that silence made the album's pictures louder. Memory is a trickster. It edits, it erases, it performs mercy. But photographs, I was learning, keep different kinds of secrets. They freeze what we thought we changed and reveal what we thought we'd buried. The child in the photos, the pale boy who returned like a recurring verse, began to appear elsewhere in the album, always on the margins of images that should have been mundane. At a picnic on a hill, he crouched under the blanket while everyone else laughed, At a baptism, he hovered in the pews between two women who looked like they had wept through the service. In a backyard where the sun should have erased him, he sat in the split shadow of a maple tree, just beyond the frame of where anyone else stood. He was never in the center. He was never the focus. He was, instead, the place where the edges of our lives frayed. Pew. I compared pictures to my memory, and the differences multiplied like a rash spreading across clear skin. In one photograph of my father grilling, the smoke from the barbecue curled upward and made a face that the rest of the image refused to let me see in full, as if a private joke were being kept between the smoke and the lens. I began to notice that in nearly every photo where the boy appeared, there was also, tucked almost as a secret into the background, a second thing. A child's toy placed strangely in a space it could not belong to, a child's shoe by the mantel even when no children were present in the living room. Sometimes the album offered details that did not exist now. A window that opened to a yard we could not find anymore, a fence with the top slats carved into little notches like teeth, a swing set in the far back that had seemingly vanished from summer evenings. I traced my finger across one page and left a thin smear of dust that glowed faint in the lamplight, as though the dust itself were remembering the touch. The attic grew colder. I wrapped my sweater tighter around my arms and told myself it was only the weather. Our old house, with its drafty bones, always felt colder upstairs. Yet the cold here felt intentional, as if the air had been arranged by an unseen hand to keep time itself from sighing too loudly. I consider myself not credulous. I am a person who writes lists, pays bills on time, misplaces my keys but always finds them in the same place. But the album was not asking for belief. It demanded attention, and when you pay attention to certain things, they will answer. That night I dreamt of photographs, rows upon rows of faces that were slightly off, eyes too wide, mouths that opened and made no sound. The dream frame slid under my eyelids and into my waking, until I could not tell whether I was moving through memory or through the book itself. I began to keep the album beside my bed and turn one page at midnight, as if the pictures would be kinder if I visited them at their most honest hour. Midnight became a ritual. The first time I read the album in the dark, I found a picture of the house at night. Its porch light a dull coin of light, and standing on the steps was my mother, hair pinned back, face turned away from the camera. Beside her, like a stain of shadow, the boy stood again, and in his free hand he held what looked like a small, broken music box. The photo showed, in perfect clarity, the wood of the music box and the tiny scratches along its lid, and I felt the scrape of those scratches along the inside of my palms, though my hands were empty. I would drift asleep after those readings with an ache behind my ribs. The house sighed. Sometimes I thought absurdly that the house was jealous of the album because the album remembered, and the house, which contained so many of its own stories, could not hold as many secrets without a witness. As weeks passed, the photographs grew more present tense. A child's hand reaching out of a doorway as if for help. A group of adults with varnished smiles, whose shadows gathered too long and pooled around their ankles, like spilled ink. And always there was the boy, moving toward the center not by stepping forward but by the world itself shifting around him. Once I found a strip of contact prints, those narrow black-bordered bands with several frames in a row, and in the first frame we were standing at the edge of a lake, maybe on a summer outing. In the following frame someone, or something, pulled our faces taut and rearranged them. Laughter froze into masks. I slid to one side to look at something only they could see. I sat up all night after that, the dark pressing at the windows like a thing that wanted entry, and I had the feeling of being observed, not by a person but by the photographs themselves, by the way their paper held on to the light it had been given. I told myself to stop. I told myself that albums are built of lies, that smiles are props, that backgrounds are well chosen, that every image is an act of selection. But the album refused to be simple. It kept bringing me back to a particular set of photos, a sequence taken on the night my brother stopped sleeping, which at the time we chalked up to nightmares and then to teenage rebellion. In the album, the sequence was longer than I remembered. At first, there was a picture of him asleep, his mouth open in an expression I had seen in dreams where one tries to run but cannot. Then another where he had turned in his sleep and his eyes were open, glossy and unfocused. The final frame of the sequence was the one that made my hands go numb. The camera had captured, shallowly lit by a bedside lamp, a shadow at the foot of his bed that arched like a question mark. The shadow had form, a suggestion of shoulders, a taper of fingers, but no face. And yet in its center, where a face should have been, a small pair of glassy eyes reflected the lamp like coins. When I showed those frames to my brother, he laughed at first, an attempt to make light of the candle found in the old part of the house. But later that night he called me from his small apartment with a voice that was not his usual steady cadence. It shook when he said, "Do you remember the attic?" He admitted haltingly that as a child he used to whisper to the darkness, promising games and sleep and company, and that sometimes the dark would answer by rearranging his shoes, by turning the radio to a different station without anyone touching it. We held the phone a long time, speaking in low, careful sentences. I told him about the album and the boy who watched from corners. He did not press me to come home. He never asked if the pictures were real. He merely said, "Don't let it sit in the open. Don't let it sit in the open. Don't let it be read." I promised and then broke the promise the next day because curiosity is a poor but persuasive god. The album started to change in smaller ways I could not rationalize. At first it was just a scratch that appeared at the edge of a page like a punctuation mark added after I had already turned it. Then one page had a smear I was certain had not been there before, a gray, fingertip-shaped blur across the glossy of a child's cheek. I thought of rodents in the attic or damp, but the smear always took the same shape, a crescent of absence, and it seemed to move, migrating slowly from photo to photo. Sometimes I would wake and find a picture I had not looked at the night before face up on the pillow beside me. Once the album lay open to a picture of the staircase, and on the top step there was dirt that matched the mud I had tracked in earlier that week, as if the album itself had been outside and had come back. I began to dream in frames that matched the album exactly. In the dreams, the boy filled the negative spaces and looked at me with a patience that was not sad but expectant, like a question that had been rehearsed for centuries. I tried to tell friends. Some laughed. Others exchanged looks with me that said they were considering the possibility that I had been living too long in my past. My mother, when I asked her about the album, went very still and finally told me something I had never known, that some photographs were kept out of sight because they were of times we do not speak of. She said it with a line of the mouth I had seen only once before, after the funeral of a man she had once loved, and then changed the subject like someone closing a window against a coming storm. I pressed further until she clutched my hand and said, "Enough." That single phrase shut the conversation like the swing of a heavy door. The next day the album was on my bed, closed, and my sweater lay across it as if someone had put it there to warm the spine. I could not tell whether I had placed it there or whether it had been placed there for me. Panic and a stubborn kind of logic fought inside me. Logic demanded the album be burned, or at least thrown into the bin. Panic whispered that destroying it would be a mistake, the kind of hubris a person displays when they attempt to remove a tooth without anesthetic. I put it in a shopping bag and drove to the river, where the water runs quick, and the old maples bow their heads. My hands trembled as I took the album from the bag, and for a moment the city noise dimmed so that all I could hear was the soft slap of water and a distant dog barking. I threw the album into the river. It hit the surface with a sound like a small defeated drum and then sank. I watched it for a long time, the way the current refused to take it easily, the way it snagged on a branch and spun, then finally found a slow place and was swallowed whole. I felt a rush of relief so overpowering it left me trembling. I went home and slept until noon with an exhaustion that felt like repentance. When I woke, my phone had a missed call from my brother, whom I had not told about the river. He asked me plainly if I had done it, and then asked, with a voice that had learned how to be small and careful, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" I lied as easily as a child saying their homework was done and said I was. We spoke no more of the album that night. For a week I felt better. The house seemed to exhale as though a weight had been lifted from its ribs. The nights were quieter, silence as ordinary as snowfall. Then 7 days after I'd watched the album sink under the current, my brother called and wavered between laughter and something bordering hysteria. He had been going through a box of his own. Old things, he said. and had found, slipped among the items, a single photograph. It showed the two of us as children on the porch steps, feet dangling, and beside us, impossibly, undeniably, the pale boy stood, his hand on my brother's shoulder. My brother told me he remembered that porch, remembered the scrape on the banister where he had once carved a heart and the way our dog used to spin in circles at dusk. He said nothing about the river. That night, a sound like someone knocking on the back door woke me. I slept with the album in my mind like a word you keep repeating until it loses meaning. I did not go downstairs. Morning explained the knocking away with a tree branch and the wind. But when I reached the kitchen, the cabinet where we kept the plates was open, and inside, among the mismatched saucers, lay the same small music box I had seen in the photograph. Broken, its latch pried, as if by a child's earnest fingers. The metal was cold to the touch and smelled faintly of the river's sediment. I understood then that sunlight and current cannot always claim what an image has remembered. Something else keeps certain things and returns them. I put that music box in a drawer and closed it as if containers could contain memory itself. Days became a rhythm of small, unnerving discoveries. I found footprints in flour on the counter that led nowhere. I woke to the smell of a candle burning in a room I had checked the night before and had seen empty. Once folding laundry, I found a child's shirt inside a drawer where no child had ever stored clothes. The shirt was clothes. The shirt was clean but smelled of earth. The fear in my house was not like the presence of a burglar. It wasn't violent in ordinary measures. It was more like someone learning the rules of a house, moving about politely, rearranging photos, placing a toy just so, and watching me to see what I would do. I began to leave small things out. A glass of milk on the counter, a scribbled note. The notes would be rearranged the next day. The milk would be gone. I started to speak to the boy. Not aloud at first, but in the harsh geometry of wishful thinking. If you are here, what do you want? The album never answered in words. It answered by changing. New photos appeared in the pages I had not shown anyone. A portrait of a man with my father's jawline but hollowed eyes. A child asleep beneath a blanket with the pattern of the quilt in my room, and in the corner of the image the suggestion of the boy's face, turned just slightly to the camera, if acknowledging a joke shared between them. The album showed scenes that couldn't have been photographed. My mother's childhood bedroom, although we had never been able to find where she grew up. A house with windows like eyes and a porch that faces wrong. A night market with lanterns and people in clothes stitched from shadows. Most disquieting was when the album began to depict things that had not yet happened. A photograph showed my kitchen table set for company, plates ready, wine glasses clean with steam still rising as if a meal had just been served. But outside the window in the picture there was a storm I had not yet seen. The next day, a late thunderstorm arrived like a script, fulfilling itself. The photographs were not merely documenting, they were scripting. I started to sleep with lights on and the television playing, as if distraction could drown the script. I found myself avoiding mirrors because in them I sometimes saw, layered over my reflection, a boy's outline like a watermark. Once in the mirror of the downstairs bathroom I saw, for the length of a single blink, the image of the album reflected beside me on the counter. It seemed impossible because I had burned the album in the river. I smashed that mirror with the heel of my palm and the shards glittered like small, honest accusations. After that, the phenomena escalated. My father, who had been distant for years and had returned to town after a hospital stay, called me frantic one morning. He spoke of waking to the sound of a child laughing under his bed the night before, of little dry footprints on his bedroom rug, and of waking to find that his teeth felt loose, as if the inside of his mouth had been rearranged in sleep. He insisted he had not been ailing when he went to sleep, yet in photos from the album he appeared older, and in one particularly ruthless frame, his face was turned away, and another face occupied the place where his should have been, thin, too young, grinning as if at a secret. My mother, meanwhile, began to have nightmares that stitched themselves into her days. She would wake and find tea cold in her cup, and the television turned to a static so dense it hummed in her bones. At a family dinner, when I confronted her about the album, when I demanded to know why our past had become a place that kept returning, she said, voice brittle with the kind of truth that makes other truths look like lies, "We broke something when we left him outside the house that winter." She let that sentence hang between us like an accusation. It was both confession and explanation. I felt my stomach open to catch the falling remnant. There was a boy, she said, almost in apology. We brought him in once because he was cold. He stayed a little too long. He stayed a little too long. She wouldn't say why he had been left out. And when I pushed, she placed her hand over mine and smiled the way you smile at someone you'll let carry the weight of something you could not bear. I pressed her further until the cracked edges of that smile revealed a small, sharp thing. My mother told me about a night when the adults had been frightened by something they could not name, and had, in the loosest terms, decided that to survive they must choose. It sounded monstrous even as she polished it with the blandness of memory. She said we had made a pact to forget the boy, to tuck him into a place of shadows, and never speak of him so he would learn to be small and silent. She said it as if this had been the least terrible decision, even the least terrible decision. My hands went cold and I realized, with a clarity that was frank and terrible, that the album was not just an album but the ledger of that omission. Every photograph where the boy appeared was a testimony of a life interrupted. Every background object that did not belong to us was evidence of an actor left unpaid. The boy's presence, slight and consistent, was the world trying to balance the books. Knowing this did not stop the phenomena. If anything, it made them angrier. The house began to enact its own tribunal. At night I would hear the piano in the living room, my grandmother's old upright, which had not worked for years, playing a piece I recognized not as a song, but as the recorded cadence of a child's rocking. Silverware rearranged itself. Photographs that had hung for years would hang in the morning at odd angles. Once locked in my room, I heard whispering move like a current under the door. It sounded like fingers turning pages. I barricaded my bedroom door with a chair and slept with a pocket knife, as if tangible objects could be a defense against an accusation of memory. Days blurred into a shape of superstition. Friends stopped visiting. At work I invented excuses. I began to carry a small bell in my bag, a silly superstition my grandmother had once told me about, that sound makes things stop. It did not always work. The boy's interventions escalated into things that could no longer be explained by loneliness or grief. The television would sometimes show static that shaped itself into a face, and then very briefly into a photograph from the album, and then it would go black. Once I woke to find, on my chest, a photograph folded and pressed into the skin of my shirt like a bedbug bite. It was of me asleep as a child, and in the photo the boy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with a smile that suggested he had been waiting a long time for something I had. Promised without remembering. The memory of being promised something, of being made into a guardian, an heir to a secret, hovered at the edge of my mind like a lost key. It was as if the album had been the contract, and every playful, kind memory we had afforded ourselves had cost something in the fine print. The family argued, then avoided argument in the way that careful people avoid cliffs, by walking in circles around the problem and pretending to smell nothing. We attempted ritual and reason both. My brother, braver perhaps because he felt guilt that cut like steel, tried to find the boy's grave, chased local records, and asked elderly neighbors whether they remembered a missing child in winter. All the records he found were small lies. A birth registered and then struck through. A name that appeared for a single year in a school ledger and then disappeared, a missing persons report that had been stamped insufficient evidence. He found in the end a note in an old diary where our grandmother had written, "We thought leaving him in the dark would keep us safe, but the dark taught us how to leave." The diary page was stained as if someone had cried, or as if water had fallen across it, and refused to be convinced it had been only water. Each of us began to live in ways that were both defensive and performative, leaving lights on in every room, setting extra places at the table with a kind of mockery, speaking aloud the names of children we hadn't seen in years, as if to keep channels open so the boy would not have to break them. Sometimes, in the very small hours, we would hear him moving through the house like a guest who believed himself welcome again. Soft footsteps on the stairs, the faint creak of a floorboard that we all learned to recognize like the cough of an old friend. The boy's visits did not always come to harm. Sometimes they left impossible tenderness, a plate of cookies on the counter that I knew I had not baked, a note in a child's hand that said simply, "I remember when you used to play the piano," and tucked inside a picture of the two of us with our knees. Knocking on the stair, a memory like a coin in a pocket. Those moments were the cruelest because they offered a warmth through which the cold could be felt more acutely. The album, I realized with a resignation that felt like heat, wanted to be read but also to be paid for. Where it could be paid for. The final change came suddenly. One night after a candle guttered out in the living room, and the house settled with the kind of silence that announces a storm, I found the album open on the coffee table where I had left it weeks earlier. In the photograph there, the family stood posed on the lawn of a house I had never seen, and in the center of the lawn an empty space was cut out in the shape of a child. The edge of that hollow was sharp as a regret. I felt my skin crawl, and I read as if someone had pressed the words into the paper, an explanation that did not use words but the ordering of images. The boy had been with us. We had fed him stories and laughter, and then one night we had decided he was too much. We had put him outside to see if the cold would teach him to go away. The photograph seemed to say that the house had agreed. There was no one in our family left untouched by this ledger. My brother stopped sleeping again. My mother began to whisper to me at night, "Excuse-less and frantic. What did we think we were saving when we closed the door?" Our father left and returned to his city apartment, unable to inhabit the house that remembered differently. The music box that we had found reappeared on the windowsill, its tiny key wound tight. No one could find it a second time, but its presence was announced by the sudden release of a melody from somewhere deep in the house, a child's lullaby that made all of us stop and listen and feel for a heartbeat like small children who had been given a reprieve. I wanted at once to comfort the boy and to punish the house for teaching us to forget. I wanted to be both compassionate and strict, to roll myself up into a shield. Then one morning, when the air smelled of rain that had not yet fallen, I opened a drawer to find, under a loose pack of letters, a single photograph. It was of my father at the front door, and beside him, eyes level with his hip, stood the boy, his fingers curled in a way that suggested both a child's clench and an old man's grief. The caption, written in a hand I knew, read, "Taken before we left." My throat closed. It was in that moment I understood the true contract. Memory is a ledger, and every ledger requires an accounting. The album had been keeping balance all along, returning what we tried to hide until we could no longer pretend that omission equaled peace. I tried then, in a way that was desperate and practical at once, to make an offering. I took photographs of the house as it was now, pictures with my phone, cheap and immediate, and printed them in black and white. I inserted them into the album. I wrote in a childlike hand I had to force from myself an apology and a promise on a scrap of paper and tucked it into the back. I set the music box on top and wound it until the melody started to spill out like small confessions. I left the album open on the porch in the rain, where the water could smear ink and maybe wash away some of the worst details. I came back in the morning to find the album gone, but the porch steps were dry. I found instead on the kitchen table a single photograph that I had not taken, the boy sitting on the steps, smiling like a child who has been given back one small, tidy thing. He held in his hand a tiny carved heart, the same heart my brother had cut into the banister years before. In that photograph there was an odd quality of finality, like a period at the end of a long sentence. I do not know if the boy left that day or if he sits now in a place that photographs cannot reach, but I do know this. The house has changed subtly, irrevocably. The photographs in the album no longer shift as they did. Where once a smear might appear overnight, there is now only the dust of ordinary living. Sometimes at night, I will awake and think I hear a child's laugh on the stairs, and I will go to the window and see nothing but the empty street and the moon. Sometimes I open the drawer where I keep the music box and find only the scent of the river, like a memory that is almost real. The album, when I took it out to look one last time, had a new photograph at the very end. A picture of me, older now, sitting in a kitchen with a lamp on and a book open, and beside me, small and unobtrusive, a child sleeping in a patched armchair, hair spread like a dark halo. I run a thumb across the glossy of that image and feel the indentation of where some other hand has touched it before me. I don't think the story is clean or moral, It is messy and human and terrible because we are capable of small cruelties and smaller mercies. If you ask me what I learned, I would say that forgetting is not a gift, it is a debt. The album taught me that memories will not stay neatly in the boxes we put them in. They will seep out like water through a crack, and when they find their way into the open, they will ask to be seen. Sometimes the things we try to hide are returning not to punish us but to be seen, to be warmed by the light we had once withheld. It is for that reason I keep the album on the highest shelf now, where dust can settle on it, where it will be disturbed only by hands that know how to read accounts. That know how to read accounts. I will not blame the boy for the cold, nor will I pretend our family was innocent. We all did what we thought would make us safe. We learned too late that safety bought in the dark has a price. On quiet evenings when the curtains lift with a subtle breath and the house remembers its own bones, I take the album down and sit with it, and I tell the pictures aloud what I am willing to do to make amends, because names spoken into rooms sometimes carry more weight than silence. Sometimes, if I listen very closely, I hear a small movement from the armchair and feel a warm hand, light as a moth's wing, press against my cheek for the briefest moment.